Welcome back, everyone. My name is Alex Hoshino, and I'm a research assistant with the Center for Asian American Christianity. Our speaker for this session is David Wang. Dr. David C. Wang is a pastor, licensed psychologist, and the Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders at Fuller Theological Seminary. He is the editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology and oversees research grants funded by the John Templeton Foundation, as well as the Lilly Endowment. And I will now hand the stage over to Dr. David Wang for his session titled Research and Practice on the Care of Christian Leaders Who Have Been Wounded in the Ministry Context.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. And welcome to the session. Thank you for joining us. And as Alex mentioned, I wear a lot of different hats. I'm a professor at Fuller. I'm a pastor part-time, pastor of spiritual formation at a local congregation in Anaheim, Fullerton area here in Southern California. And I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. So I still maintain a small private practice, mainly where for the most part, I see many Christian leaders like pastors and missionaries. And what I like to tell people is that even though I'm both a psychologist as well as a pastor, I was a pastor first before I became a psychologist. And I think it's fair to say that I'm a psychologist today based on my experiences and what I observed 2 or 3 decades ago when I first started off as a college and young adults pastor in the church I grew up in San Jose, California. And it was through those experiences, bearing witness to the manifold mental health struggles in the Chinese immigrant church that I grew up in, um, and also bearing witness and also experiencing how challenging it is emotionally and psychologically for many of us pastors and Christian leaders, where the role of being a pastor it takes us into regularly into situations that are very challenging emotionally, and witnessing and experiencing firsthand the mental health needs not just of our congregations and our communities, but also the mental health needs of our pastors and missionaries and Christian leaders. So well, that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to take on for the role that I have at Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm the Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders. And part of my work at Fuller is to help the seminary kind of reimagine what theological education might be if we were to take seriously the emotional formation or the cultivating emotional resilience among our pastors and future Christian leaders. Because we know that intellectual formation is important, we know that spiritual formation is important. And the research that I'll be sharing with you in just a few moments also speaks to the importance of the emotional formation of the Christian leader. And one of the reasons why is because research does show, and I think you all probably know this even better because you're living it firsthand, that the ministry context is oftentimes a very emotionally troubling and emotionally challenging, emotionally distressing context for us pastors and Christian leaders. So, what I'm hoping to do is, as I talk through some of the research as well as some of the my personal reflections on the research, that I hope that it can be not just informative but also validating. So, there might be a chance where it might be a possibility where, as we talk through this research, none of this is new information for you because you've experienced it all. And if that's the case, then that's totally great. And I hope that one of the things you can take away from this is the feeling that you're absolutely not alone and that there are trends within the larger kind of body of Christ that would attest that others are also experiencing similar things as yourself. So that's a little bit about myself, and I'm going to switch over to sharing my slides, and let's jump into this presentation. Right. So the question I want to start with today, and if we were in person, I would have love to split you all into small groups, but for purpose of our time together, I want to invite you to reflect on this question just for a few moments. And the question is this: what kinds of emotional wounds have you either personally experienced or have you observed among others who are your fellow pastors and Christian leaders over the course of your work and ministry? And feel free to just reflect on this. If you're open to maybe sharing some of this, you're welcome to do that in the chat. I really appreciate Jose jumping in and shares. He writes helplessness and powerlessness, and that's very, very understandable. And I think that is a really helpful backdrop to kind of carry and contain a lot of the research that I'll share later. Um, I'm reading Disappointment and Disillusionment, and that's something I can absolutely personally relate to. I kind of went through my own faith deconstruction after I had my first stint as a pastor, being silenced, abuse of leadership power, um, um, and and Darcy, I mean, sometimes that being silenced is universal. And sometimes it might even be specific to gender and race as well. I think there's ways that Asians, and in particular Asian women, from people I've worked with, where that experience of being silenced is very, very common. Burnout, lack of boundaries in church, varying expectations that switch at a whim. Yes. Uh, Distrust, insecurity. We should probably write this down. This would be really helpful for many other people to read. I think so many of us can relate to this. Being misunderstood, gaslighting in both my role as professor of theology and in the white church. Yes. And then Gerald being the object of projections. Absolutely. I found that as now that I'm in my 40s, I'm no longer giving out Big Brother vibes, and now I'm giving out fatherhood vibes. And for those in our congregations that have, fatherhood wounds, I'm finding myself as the recipient of a lot of those projections and transference kind of dynamics. Not being invited to give a contribution, being betrayed, disregard of number of years of serving faithfully. Yes, putting minority communities against each other, Christian nationalism. Yes, that's something that I'm deeply concerned about. And we're actually doing research on the formation of future pastors as it relates to Christian nationalism. What are those dispositions among seminary students that put people at risk for endorsing those kinds of viewpoints? Um, Being berated, ageism. So absolutely keep them coming. And I want to encourage all of us uh, to read all the thoughtful reflections on chat. So what I'd like to do in our time together, and granted, we only have about 30 to 35 minutes before we jump into Q&A. So we'll just go as far as we can. Um, but as a general kind of signpost for our time together, I'll start off by sharing a little bit about some of the research on common forms of emotional wounds from the ministry context. And granted, these are findings for kind of a more general population of Christian ministers. It's not necessarily specific just to Asian American Christian leaders. And that's actually one area I'd love to explore and process with you towards the latter half of our time together, which is the question of, well, to what extent does this conversation about emotional wounds, how is it similar or different when we contextualize it onto the experiences of Asian American Christian leaders? And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about some of the trauma research on social support and emotional validation, because there's actually quite a lot of overlap between the emotional wounds that many Christian leaders experience and symptoms of psychological trauma and post traumatic stress disorder. And then, if we have time, likely we will not, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the implications of this whole discussion on our spiritual formation and our understanding of spiritual maturity. So, I do kind of want to do a deep dive and just jump right in and talk about one unfortunate form and very pronounced and serious form of emotional wounds in the ministry context, and that has to do with inappropriate sexual behavior. And research suggests that among at least four major denominational groups, over a third of pastors acknowledge engaging in some sort of inappropriate sexual behavior for a minister. 12% admitted to having some form of sexual intercourse, and um, uh, sociologist Mark Chaves out of Duke Divinity, he's done some extensive work on the topic of clergy sexual misconduct, and he's found that on average, there's an average number of seven female victims of misconduct per affected congregation. So by the time something actually um, moves to the fore and is reported and becomes public knowledge, usually it's the case that there's multiple individuals involved. It usually, unfortunately, does not go public after just the first or second for various reasons. One of which being that these kinds of experiences tend to be severely underreported, especially if it happens within a church context. I think many of you guys are aware of the latest uh, kind of reports of sexual misconduct and mishandling of situations like that from the Southern Baptist Convention. I think that was just last year, but unfortunately, that kind of thing is not uncommon among other denominations or religious groups. And I just wanted to share one of the individuals I worked with in the past, or one of my colleagues worked with, and just read her testimony. And this is a testimony of a missionary kid. And she said, I heard about a missionary kid in a missionary boarding school who was sexually abused by a staff member who was also a missionary. And her parents informed the school and the mission agency, but were met with indifference and inaction. The school and agency felt like it might cause problems for them if they exposed the staff member, so they encouraged the family to work through this incident privately. And you know, and I think this theme of indifference, and I don't want to touch this, I don't want to engage this, unfortunately, is all too common among so many of our ministry contexts. And the question I'd love to invite you to reflect on, and again, if you feel comfortable sharing your thoughts on the chat, you're welcome to. Is why are many churches and Christian organizations so reluctant to address these sorts of serious problems and instead try to cover up, ignore, and minimize these situations, and in so doing, oftentimes make things much, much more worse for everyone involved, perhaps except the perpetrator. And um, in Jose, fear of scandal, I think that's very fair, and I think the unfortunate thing about this is if you try to cover it up, and it later comes to light, and now people know not only about the actual event, but the cover up, it becomes even more of of a scandal. And Jeff Wright's losing face, and I think that might be it's not unique to Asian American contexts or churches, but that is a thing as well. You know, lack of reporting structures. I think that's really important as well. It might affect donors or financial support from organizational leadership. So there are absolutely potential implications for the larger ministry context. And the research actually validates this, which we'll share a little more later. Misogyny, patriarchy absolutely is still present, underlying culture that have not been addressed or acknowledged. Absolutely. We see it as attacking our own, and we see accountability as punishment rather than restoration and love. Absolutely. You don't want to hinder the ministry. Unfortunately, even though we don't want to hinder it, but when we really look at this, we're actually uh, um, sacrificing integrity. And even though it's not public, that's really the center of the of what we minister out of. Fear of wealthy donors. They themselves do not know how to handle the situation and what is the right way to go about this. Not enough known guidance is out there on various circumstances. That's really fair. And that's why I'm really grateful for a context like this where we can actually start the conversation and perhaps put together some resources so that we can minimize that kind of thing. Skewed understanding of God's grace. That's a great, I've seen that a lot where people will um, They refuse to exercise leadership when it needs to happen and put boundaries on situations to protect the rest of the church in the name of grace. Probably more cases, so never open the box. Yes. Skewed understanding of sin as merely vertical and individual. Right. Instead of institutional. Absolutely. Perceiving that removing the minister is solving the problem. Not, yeah, exactly. When the problem is actually perhaps a more systemic situation. There's too many examples of churches where after they have the church has kind of gone through this roller coaster ride with a head pastor who tends to be narcissistic, and that narcissistic pastor gets transitions to a different role. People don't realize that that's only the tip of the iceberg, because sometimes, a lot of times, a lot of church cultures are implicitly built around a narcissistic personality, so they will attract another personality like that in the future. Lack of capacity to do with shame and inevitability of will come up if addressed out loud. Um, and great to see you feel, and protecting the offender. And so it sounds like you all, this is definitely hitting, striking a nerve among many of us. And this is not a surprise at all. This sounds like many of us here can certainly relate to this. Thank you. And keep them. So continuing the story, this event naturally caused this missionary kid to wonder if God cared about her situation, and went a long time believing that her problems, aka her trauma, and this is absolutely a trauma, were not important to God or the church. And this type of spiritual trauma leads many missionary kids and adult missionaries as well, to leave the church altogether, or leave the church once they're grown up, or to leave the faith altogether. And I wouldn't be surprised if many of us either have struggled with these questions ourselves, or if we know of many colleagues who have gone through these emotional wounds in the ministry context. And in addition to the emotional sequelae, um, also struggle with the spiritual consequences of that, of, um, wondering if God actually cares, and pondering and struggling through the perceived and experiential absence of God and during a time when we very much needed Him. Okay, so that's one form of emotional wounds in the ministry context. And I think this perhaps could fit into a larger category of um, conflicts with ministry team members. And the research also suggests that perhaps the greatest source of ministry wounding, and it is the number one source of missionary attrition. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was the number one source behind pastors stepping down from their callings and positions prematurely, is actually conflicts with other ministry team members, with other Christians. And that this is presents a greater challenge, or challenge over and above the challenges inherent in working with our communities, with the unreached, with financial challenges, with the stresses of living and doing work cross culturally, especially for cross cultural missionaries, and the challenges related to the ministry work itself. So, aside from all of those challenges, which are inherently challenging, notwithstanding, the greatest source of stress and wounding is actually still not our interactions with people who aren't Christian, but actually with our fellow Christian leaders. Yeah. And agreed with you, Sarah. I know this is older research, and unfortunately, the research is fairly piecemeal on this topic, so people don't kind of continue this. I'm hoping to change that a little bit, but I suggest, and uh, believe that this is probably still an issue, just as much, if not more. Unfortunately, there actually isn't much more recent data than this. This was a commissioned research project, I think, by the U.S. Center for World Mission, and we're hoping to launch some similar program of research at Fuller Theological Seminary in the upcoming year or two on the nature of emotional wounds. And a lot of this ministry team conflict, um, unfortunately, is due to the poor emotional and mental health of some team leaders and team members, one of my psychologist colleagues, Dave Wickstrom, and he works as a member care psychologist for different denominations as well as missionary agencies. And some of the work that he does, and I've done a little bit of this as well, is he does very robust psychological assessment screenings for missionary applicants as well as uh, pastoral applicants that are about to become ordained, and he does a full battery of psychological assessment with them. And based on his experience of doing this kind of thing with hundreds of Christian leaders, he identified several red flags. And some of them include major mental illness. So he's talking about significant levels, severe levels of depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder, different forms of somatization, chronic fatigue syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as a history of recurrent minor illness, addiction, eating disorders, serious family issues, and the like. And he particularly highlights the the challenge and the, the very the very bright red flag of personality disorders, especially in the form of histrionic tendencies, narcissistic personality, and borderline personality disorder in particular. So one of the classes I teach at Fuller is the class on dialectical behavior therapy, which is an evidence-based treatment for borderline personality disorder. Um, and unfortunately, borderline, I've seen too many examples in the ministry context and ones that I've been a part of, as well as ministries that my colleagues and friends have been a part of, where they, without knowing, um, uh, perhaps in the name of grace, or perhaps because there's just so much need, they brought on ministry team members, they hired pastors with borderline personality disorder or some other form of access to personality disorder. And it was, it just caused so much problems in the ministry, and it burned out everyone. And the consequences of it are often, unfortunately, quite drastic if we don't catch some of these things early on. And to be fair, sometimes it's really hard to capture or catch some of these things early on because they can seem somewhat hidden, at least in the initial stages of getting to know somebody. And Dave Wickstrom validates this, and he suggests that personality disorders are actually usually the cause for some of the greatest problems in a ministry context. And this is why it's important for us to partner together as mental health professionals as well as Christian leaders so that we can provide extra support and coverage and an extra set of eyes so that we can hopefully prevent some of this stuff from happening. And one study, the testimony that Dave shared with me, I just want to read it with you. He says this: on rare occasions and to my chagrin, for various reasons, like countertransference, faking abilities, or defensiveness on part of the candidate, I had downplayed the data evident in the psychological testing he ran and had mistakenly given the candidate a clean bill of health and a statement of their readiness to move overseas. So even us psychologists, we struggle with how we apply grace. Sometimes we're just like, well, you know, the data might be suggesting there's something's there, but we'll just extend some grace and give them a clean bill of health, and unfortunately, that does come back to bite us sometimes as well. And he says, there was a time when I had downplayed a classic borderline personality profile on the MMPI-2, which is one of the standard psychological assessment instruments that we often give, because the candidate was so articulate. Um, I found out later that they had an IQ in the genius range, and I was fooled. I was fooled. Needless to say, when that candidate became a missionary and almost destroyed the work and the people on the team, I was able to look back and have determined never to mistrust the data again. And Jose raises a great question. For a big church that can be selective, they can probably screen. But what about a struggling church? Because sometimes there aren't other options. And agreed. If you are a part of a church that happens to be part of a larger denomination that has an office for member care, where these kinds of psychological assessment resources are available, then absolutely I want to encourage you guys to take advantage of those things. But for churches, those of us who serve in churches like myself that are smaller and aren't part of a denomination yet, this becomes more of a struggle. And I think this is where um, it might be really important for us to form partnerships with Christian mental health professionals in our area so that we can have, at the very least, some people or some directions that we can take to consult, especially if um, uh, there might be some red flags or latent concerns. And I think perhaps one of the takeaways of this conversation is if there are red flags or latent concerns, I just want to encourage y'all to really consider doing the due diligence instead of just kind of pushing that candidate forward. I know there's a lot of needs in the ministry. I can absolutely relate. But sometimes that little extra due diligence might actually save us in the long run from a lot of heartache and a lot of pain as well. Yeah. Um, Absolutely. That's a great question. So, how do we discern the difference between God using us, still our own weakness and flaws, versus danger and unhealthy signs? And to be fair, it requires a lot of wisdom and discernment. And even for the most trained individuals, we're not going to get it perfectly. So, I wish there was this rubric that we can just follow that would catch, all of these 100%. And I don't think that such a rubric exists. And to be fair, all of us, none of us are perfect, and all of us will struggle with these things. And we most or all of us have gone through seasons, brief or extended, where we might have experienced depression and anxiety, and that is not necessarily a red flag that would suggest that we're not fit for ministry. Um, uh, but so it is ultimately a question of, severity and, to what extent is this pronounced? And there's so many different factors that play, which, perhaps we can talk a little bit more, during the Q&A. I heard a story from a counselor who worked in an overseas, uh, counseling center for expatriate workers who saw all members of a local missions team within a 6-month span. One by one, all of the team members were coming, stating that they were burnt out and planned to leave the field. Finally, the last member of the team leader, entered into therapy with the counselor, and the counselor soon realized that this team leader had an undiagnosed personality disorder that had been the root cause of all the team conflict that had caused the entire team to leave the field. Sadly, all of the team members were so disgruntled and burnt out that this ended their missionary service in less than a stellar way. And again, I think this illustrates lots of points that we've already covered. But unfortunately, a lot of times people will interpret a situation like this, perhaps through an over spiritualized lens, through a non systemic lens, which unfortunately will place a potential blame on the individuals when in fact there was very much a very compelling explanation for what. Continuing, another significant contributor to ministry wounds, and I think a lot of us have already mentioned this earlier, has to do with the lack of safe and confidential spaces, emotionally safe and confidential spaces for Christian leaders. That many Christian leaders feel like, you know, they have no one to talk to about the feelings of being hurt by other leaders. We have no one to talk to about feeling burnt out. We have no one to talk to about some of the doubts that we're struggling with in our own faith, or perhaps potential problems in our marriage and family. And almost everyone has challenges and problems in our marriage and family. But what's unique about us pastors and Christian leaders is that sometimes it feels like we live in this glass jar where everyone is peering into our personal as well as our professional life. And recent research conducted by Lifeway Research actually suggested, and this is during the COVID-19 pandemic, that one of the most powerful predictors uh, of Christian leaders burning out, it has to do with whether they have even one space or one person where they can share vulnerably and honestly. And based on their number crunching, they found that if a pastor actually just has one, we don't even need like two or three or four. We don't need a lot. As long as we just have one context or one person where we can share honestly and vulnerably with, that the likelihood of burnout, at least during COVID-19, actually palpably decreases. in a statistically significant way. And one of the reflections that I draw from that research, and it's a sad and tragic reflection, is that it points to the reality that there are so many of us who actually have no spaces or no context where we can do such a and there's a lot of good reasons why this might be the case because a lot of times there's legitimate and valid fears that if they share vulnerably and honestly, they might be kicked out of their church. Um, and they have to leave the ministry. And this actually happened with several of my clients who were formerly in the ministry, where they shared appropriately before a concern blew up, and when the rest of the church or ministry organization heard it, they just dismissed them immediately without any kind of process of restoration or healing or recovery. There are also potential fears that people will be judged as lacking in faith or being an unfaithful Christian. And someone even mentioned this directly: fears that they will lose financial support from people or churches that support them. Fears that that those they're ministering to will not want to come become Christians, and many other valid and legitimate fears. And as a result, many Christian leaders end up deciding, understandably, deciding to isolate, to hold their pain, and to just keep going. And despite the further hurt this may cause to themselves and others, and a lot of times this is unfortunately the pathway to burnout for a lot of Christian leaders. And sometimes we do this again due to fear of failure, belief that God cares more about the work of the ministry rather than their personhood, and perhaps encouragement from fellow Christians to just keep on going despite trauma, family difficulties, and crises of faith. And unfortunately, some of the worst advice I've ever heard about life and ministry, I've heard from Christians. Um, Fears that Christian communities and organizations being dismissive or judgmental of their difficult experiences. I find that people's capacity to hold other people's pain, it can be quite varied even within Christian communities. Some additional challenges within the ministry context include the following: high or unrealistic expectations, not only that are placed on the minister and leader, not just for the minister, but for their spouses and children. I have uh, two doctoral clinical psychology students that are actually doing research now, qualitative and quantitative, on pastors' kids and the emotional challenges of having these expectations placed on them throughout their entire life through childhood. And there's also, as you know, stressors within the ministry context. You have personal criticism and attack. I remember people in the chat mentioned betrayal as well. Boundary ambiguity, where you're a pastor, you're always a pastor 24/7. You can't just go home and take off that pastor hat because we're potentially on call all the time. Emotional isolation, exposure to crises and unpredictability of crises, interpersonal and administrative demands, as well as performance oriented tasks. And I just want to speak briefly about exposure to crises and unpredictability of crises. One of the research projects that I work on, it's a grant funded by the Lilly Endowment. I'm partnering with a network of 25 predominantly African American churches and church pastors to do trauma informed care work. So, in other words, we're helping build capacity for these Christian leaders and for the church systems that they're part of to be more attuned and responsive to the mental health and trauma needs of their staff as well as their community. And part of our discussion has to do with the trauma needs not just of our congregation but of our pastors. And research suggests that pastors, in comparable levels with social workers, you know, ER doctors, and other helping professions, that their level of exposure to trauma is really it's sky high. and we don't talk about trauma, but it's still trauma. And one of the reasons it makes sense because when you think of it, when a crisis happens among an individual in a church or a congregation, if someone passes away unexpectedly, if some other unexpected crisis happens when someone dies, who is one of the first people that are always called? It's the pastor and the mission. It's the pastor. Um, and so when you think about the number of exposures to crises and trauma, especially when it comes to indirect exposure to crises and trauma, pastors are very much in the front line, and we need to take that seriously. We just have a few more minutes, and then we'll switch over to Q&A. And there's also the impact of unhealthy church environments on pastors. And I think this relates really well to many of the sentiments shared on the chat, where there's oftentimes a neglect and a failure to look at systemic contributions to unhealthy church environments. And some examples of unhealthy church environments are when congregations are opposed to even small changes because they're attached to the way things are. When there's two sets of members within a congregation who polarize issues among group lines, and this has been a especially salient challenge for many of our churches. Um, I'm working with so many different pastors who are pastoring congregations that are on different sides of the political spectrum, and it feels like a near impossible to impossible task to keep everyone together. Um, and unfortunately, I think one of my reflections is that I feel like a lot of people are being formed more by the news channel that they watch than by scripture or the Christian faith. And then some congregation members actively use things like intimidation and abusive tactics to oppose clergy. And I know these are somewhat older resources, but if that's an area of interest for further reading and exploration, you can consider some books on Amazon.com. One's by Rediger titled Clergy Killers. And then Rediger also wrote a decade later another book called The Toxic um, Congregation. So consider checking those two. Out. Um, the last thing, as we're kind of beginning to land the plane together, I just wanted to end with a brief conversation about burnouts. And again, a lot of this is older research, and I might suggest that these figures might be not just the same, but even higher, especially during these last 2 or 3 years of COVID. That burnout is a prominent challenge facing Christian leaders, and that many emotional hazards contribute in the ministry context contribute to burnout, like personal relationships, depression, stress, sexuality, and assertiveness. And more recent research found some empirical predictors of burnout, like depression, isolation, loneliness, marital tension and conflict, as well as certain coping behaviors like behavioral disengagement, mental disengagement, or an exclusive focus on venting emotions. I want to close by just highlighting what the research identifies as three of the most common components or symptoms of burnout, and that is emotional exhaustion. And symptoms of emotional exhaustion might include chronic tension, chronic anxiety, chronic fatigue, insomnia, depersonalization, where you're cultivating this negative, callous, excessively detached response. Depersonalization is a form of dissociation, which is a very common trauma response, especially to relational trauma. So when you see an individual change their personality in such a way where they used to be very personal and very relational, and then over time they end up evolving into someone who just treats other people like numbers or objects, that is potentially a sign of burnout. And then last, a lack of personal accomplishment, where you have a tendency to negatively evaluate the worth of your work, feeling insufficient, feeling incapable with regards to the ability to perform one's job. So when people start feeling like and really internalizing the sense of failure where like, I'm a pastor, but I can't really do anything right. And I don't think I don't think I'm a good pastor anymore. That also is potentially another sign of burnout. So it's not just the emotional exhaustion, but it's also the depersonalization, as well as a sense of a lack of personal accomplishment, either personal and or professional.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, for your wise words and insights for the church. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for coming, everyone.